Between 1919 and 1920, over 500,000 Italian workers took over their factories, occupied them, and ran them themselves. This was called Biennio Rosso. This is called Biennio Rosso, and it's often highlighted in anarchist history as a what could have been moment, because while the radical anarchists and communist workers who occupied the factories wanted their movement to be permanent, the trade union bureaucracy folded and entered negotiations with factory owners. However, as journalist Dwight MacDonald wrote in 1938, the reformist government of Giovanni Giulieri did nothing, quote, to enforce the concessions won by the workers. The employers simply disregarded these scraps of paper and poured funds ever more copiously into the treasury of Mussolini. The final upshot of all this respect for law and order was, of course, the March on Rome. Failure of the Democratic Party that ultimately led to the election of Donald Trump can be marked as beginning during the 1968 presidential election. After Robert F. Kennedy's assassination, delegates comprised of party operatives were allowed to move to a different candidate, and they ultimately chose Hubert Humphrey, Lyndon Johnson's vice president, who was strongly associated with the war in Vietnam, over Eugene McCarthy, the candidate most associated with the anti-war movement. Humphrey, of course, lost and Nixon won. However, instead of considering the prospects of what might have occurred should McCarthy have been nominated, the Democratic Party took away the lesson that their loss was on account of seeming too closely aligned with the left. In 1972, after Nixon won re-election, the Coalition for a Democratic Majority was founded by the anti-communist neoconservative progenitor Henry Jackson, including amongst their ranks future neoconservatives like Paul Wolfowitz, Richard Pearl, and Jeane Kirkpatrick. While their hardline centrist efforts were defeated largely when Henry Jackson took fifth in the Democratic primary that Jimmy Carter won, the coalition's efforts were revamped after successive Democratic defeats in presidential elections, when Al Frum founded the Democratic Leadership Council in 1985 with a number of former Coalition for a Democratic Majority members. In 1989, then Governor of Arkansas, Bill Clinton, became the chairman of the DLC, by which point the DLC was receiving funding from Fortune 500 corporations like AT&T and Philip Morris. And when Clinton ran in the 1992 Democratic primaries, firms like Goldman Sachs supported his run through funding the DLC. And while Clinton won twice, George W. Bush beat out two centrist Democrats in both of his presidential elections, so it's not exactly clear that centrism translates to electoral success. By the 2000s, it didn't matter how centrist a Democrat was. Republicans were gonna call them a socialist. The Bush campaign accused Al Gore and his running mate, Joseph Lieberman, of engaging in class warfare. And in 2009, a resolution was proposed by members of the RNC that would have formally asked Democrats to change their name to the Democrat Socialist Party. If anything, centrism was proving to be a losing electoral strategy. While Obama governed as a centrist, he won promising a public option, transparency, accountability for war crimes, ending tax breaks for corporations that offshore, and with the help of billions of dollars and a highly sophisticated marketing campaign that literally won awards. Meanwhile, as even neoliberal stooge Matthew Iglesias would admit in 2016, it's good that third world countries don't have building codes. The base of the Democratic Party, black voters, young people, labor unions, all hold populist economic commitments, marking the writing on the wall for Hillary Clinton-style centrism. And now Iglesias wrote that predicting a Clinton win over Trump on account of Trump being so crazy. But Clinton's centrism proved too much to overcome. Her entire life was a repudiation of that populism Iglesias identified. In her autobiography, Clinton described herself in high school as a Goldwater girl, Barry Goldwater being the architect of the Southern strategy who argued against Brown v. Board. In the 90s, she defended her husband's crime legislation using the racist term super predators.
They are not just gangs of kids anymore. They are often the kinds of kids that are called super predators. No conscience, no empathy. We can talk about why they ended up that way, but first we have to bring them to heel.
As senator, she voted for the war in Iraq, as well as the bank bailout, and as Secretary of State, she oversaw the intervention in Libya that plunged that country into chaos. Meanwhile, all the relevant information suggests Sanders would have at least had a better chance against Trump. As early as October 2015, polls showed Sanders beating Trump by a wider margin than Clinton, and this remains consistent. The Real Clear Politics average from May 6th to June 5th predicted Sanders would beat Trump by 10.4 points, while Clinton was only ahead by 3.2. However, Clinton-style centrism is what the ruling class preferred. Over the course of the 4 campaigns Clinton ran between 1999 and 2016, 3 of her 5 largest individual donors were Goldman Sachs, Citibank, and JP Morgan. Naturally, she was corporate media's favored candidate. During the primaries, Sanders received 2/3 of the coverage Clinton received, and Sanders' coverage was largely negative. In 2016, between January and May, Sanders received negatively slanted articles from the Bezos-owned Washington Post at a ratio of 5-1 compared to Clinton. And some of the articles were patently ridiculous. My favorite from April read, "Bernie Sanders keeps saying his average donation is $27. His own numbers contradict that." And upon reading the article, the shocking truth is revealed. The average was actually $27.88. Most importantly, the media served to legitimize a slanted primary process. Democratic officials disproportionately disqualified Sanders delegates from attending the Nevada State Democratic Convention in May. At that convention, Nevada State Democratic Party chairwoman Roberta Lang implemented rules that gave her exclusive control over the convention after a voice vote was held that she clearly lost. Like she just decided she heard more yays than nays. Lang then systematically prevented all efforts from Sanders supporters to challenge the exclusion of the Sanders delegates, resulting in Clinton receiving 7 delegates and Sanders only receiving 5. But after the fact, instead of investigating DNC wrongdoing, national media focused on a claim from a solitary source. Local journalist John Ralston, you John Ralston, that Sanders supporters threw chairs in response to the outcome. Ralston would later admit he had not actually seen chairs thrown. You John Ralston. And Snopes would debunk the claim, but the damage was done. Virtually no one reported on the actual proceedings. The media, skewing reality, regularly reported on Clinton's lead over Sanders, considering pledged superdelegates. Superdelegates being individuals, usually current or former politicians, who get to vote for whoever they want at the Democratic National Convention. Bill Clinton was one of 15% of all delegates who were superdelegates in 2016. While superdelegates historically switched back and forth until the convention, one day before the June 7th, 2016 California primary, the AP declared Clinton the victor of the entire race, reporting unnamed, previously unaligned superdelegates had pledged for Clinton, and virtually every other mainstream media outlet covered that report. There's no way to know the exact effect it had, saying the California primary doesn't matter. The polls showed Sanders and Clinton had been even in the lead up to the primary, and Sanders' rallies had garnered far greater attendance than Clinton's. However, Clinton won 53.4% of the vote. Naturally, Sanders supporters were left with the feeling that corporate media and the Democratic establishment had not given Sanders a fair shake. That feeling was largely vindicated in July 2016 when WikiLeaks published nearly 20,000 DNC emails revealing collusion between the Clinton campaign and the DNC. Emails revealed the DNC actively acted as an arm of the Clinton campaign, containing discussions on how to mitigate criticism of Clinton and sabotage Sanders. For example, in May 2016, Politico reported that less than 1% of $61 million raised by the Hillary Victory Fund, a joint fundraising committee comprised of the DNC, 32 state party committees, and the Clinton campaign, went to down-ballot candidates. The rest was funneled to the Clinton campaign, effectively allowing high-dollar donors to subvert the 2016 legal donation cap of $5,400. Emails revealed DNC Communications Director Luis Miranda emailed colleagues to find the best suited Democratic official who they knew for a fact was not the one that leaked to Politico to go on Morning Joe to do damage control for the Clinton campaign. And after the first 20,000 emails were published, DNC chair Debbie Wasserman Schultz stepped down. You, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, replaced by CNN contributor Donna Brazile. But as WikiLeaks published more emails, Brazile would have to step down because it was revealed that with inside information working for CNN, she briefed the Clinton campaign on debate questions prior to a debate with Sanders. Now, Brazile would later admit in a book she wrote that the primary process was slanted. According to an investigation she conducted, Obama's 2012 campaign had left the DNC in massive debt. To dig themselves out of this hole, the DNC struck a deal with the Clinton campaign that decided, quote, in exchange for raising money and investing in the DNC, Hillary would control the party's finances, strategy, and all the money raised. The Clinton campaign got the final say on who would be the party communications director and communications staff, and in turn, the quote, DNC also was required to consult with the campaign about all other staffing, budgeting, data, analytics, and mailings. Brazile notes a conversation she had with the Clinton campaign CFO, Gary Gensler, who, quote, described the party as fully under the control of Hillary's campaign. Still, Sanders admitted defeat and endorsed Clinton. What we were left with was demoralized Sanders supporters, an uninspiring centrist candidate, and a fascist Republican nominee who didn't need to win the popular vote, but because of the legacy of slavery, only had to win an electoral college. At this point in history, violence, neoliberalism, and media society had dismantled people power in the US, while deindustrialization, mass incarceration, radical inequality, and the gutting of welfare had ushered in an era of unique precarity. And I'll note, Bernie Sanders did not represent the same kind of radicalism as the workers of the Bienio Rosso. By European standards, he would have been a liberal with a mixed voting record, but he was the furthest left viable political option in 2016, leading a campaign funded by small dollar donations that promised social democratic policies. By subverting his movement, the Democratic Party acted like the trade union bureaucracy who folded in Italy, allowing for the rise of Mussolini. In our context, we were left with Trump. And there's a lot more to say about this, as well as the 2020 election and the 2024 election, but I'm gonna stop here because I think it's an important place in history to dwell on. The 2016 election will be looked back on as a turning point in US history. So I want to take this time to reiterate the main points that I've been trying to make in these videos concerning the nature of our present day predicament. 1. The failure of society to contend with working class, anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-imperialist politics has created an overwhelming sense of dejection that manifests occasionally in chaotic and violent ways. 2. Political dejection is an asset to the system rather than an unfortunate byproduct. 3. Neoliberalism has produced an overwhelming sense of alienation and overstimulation. 4. Neoliberalism was only able to triumph through violently dismantling the political and revolutionary movements that stood in its way. 5. The violence of neoliberalism put in motion a process whereby the ruling class firmly reinstated itself at the forefront of political power. 6. Efforts to cultivate people power when they're not smashed by the violence of the state are smothered by a suffocating media society and an undemocratic political system. All this has left us with virtually no means for combating the fascist threat that is Donald Trump. In the coming videos, we're going to dissect the nature of Trumpism and what I call inverted fascism, and maybe, just maybe, figure out how to resist it. And still like, comment, and subscribe so that publishers will look twice on my book.